All right, we can start to come back from the break, and I'd like to introduce our next speaker. John Zeiger is the manager of the Thane Family Forest at the New York Botanical Garden. He holds a master's degree in conservation biology from SUNY ESF and a bachelor's in natural resources from Cornell University. Prior to his current position, he managed 1,000 acres of forest and other natural areas for the Westchester Land Trust. His previous work also included wildlife monitoring or habitat restoration in Arizona, California, Wisconsin, and Jamaica. Please extend a warm welcome to John Zeiger.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for the invitation and taking some time to listen to this talk. So I'm going to present on the Thane Family Forest, Urban Old Growth Forest Stewardship at NYBG, and my current position is the manager of the Thane Family Forest at the New York Botanical Garden in Bronx, New York. And this presentation is going to be broken into four main parts. The first is going to be on the importance of urban forest stewardship. Then I'm going to talk about protecting the Thane family forest itself and the work that we've been doing for about 20 years here at the garden. Then I'll talk about how we're going beyond protecting and we're trying to enhance the biodiversity of the Thane family forest. And lastly, I'll talk about how we're taking some of the lessons that we've learned and expanding our restoration work into kind of a regional focus in the Bronx River watershed. To start, urban forests have tremendous value to a multitude of stakeholders. So, forests do a lot of good things everywhere, but in urban areas, these things are often more important. Um, forests work to mitigate air and water pollution. And the way that they do that, basically, urban air particles can be deposited on the leaves of plants. And then also the stomata of plants will absorb different harmful pollutants and remove them from the air. They protect water sources by allowing water to infiltrate the soil instead of run off. And when water infiltrates the soil, it's naturally filtered by microbes before it's released. It also reduces sedimentation into rivers and water bodies. Forests are an oasis of green space. They're an opportunity for people to kind of recreate in nature, and that's really important in urban areas because we don't really want, as land managers, we don't really want urban sprawl. We want people to live in dense cities. If you have density, then you don't have the kind of environmental impact that you see if everyone tries to have their little piece of nature. So this, by making cities more livable, we're protecting the areas outside of cities. Urban forests reduce urban heat, and a lot of people understand that trees, they shade you and they reduce heat. Less people know that trees basically sweat. They transpire water, and that can reduce the heat of neighborhoods, maybe even 1,000 acres, or sorry, 1,000 feet away from a forest. It might be cooler because that forest is there. And urban forests have tremendous wildlife value. Here we have a red-tailed hawk. We have hawks in the urban forest at the garden. But there's also, even in New York City, there's endangered wildlife that live in our urban forest. And then because urban forests are kind of so convenient for different research institutions, for colleges, for different schools, and for children, there's a lot of educational and research value to urban forests, even more so than more rural forests. And one thing that I've noticed coming from managing more suburban and rural forests, coming to managing urban forests, is that every decision you make is more important. There's a lot of different stakeholders and stakeholder interests that you have to balance, and you have to do that everywhere, but in urban areas, it becomes much more of a balance than in other areas, just because people, which is a good thing, people care about the forest so much. So unfortunately, these urban forests, which have tremendous value, and I'm sure many of you know this very well, urban forests are under threat. And, there's a lot of threats, but I see there being four really big ones. The first threat, as we definitely all know as practitioners, are invasive species. And I always try to caveat this with we're doing a lot of work around language of invasive species here. And I always like to, there's a few things I'm trying to do. For example, like with the plant that we're viewing now, I would call it knotweed. We're trying to remove certain, places of origin from invasive species. And we're also trying to use language and discussing invasives in ways that, invasive species aren't really the problem. It's people globalizing ecology that is the problem, and species that might be tremendously important in different habitats, when they're moved to other habitats, can have a lot of problems, as I'm sure all of you are very aware. And we have a lot of these invasive species at the forest that create monocultures that disrupt the ecology and are one of the big focuses of our management. About 60% of our staff time in the forest horticulture team is spent on invasive species removal. Climate change is a really important threat to urban forests, even more so than rural forests, because urban forests already have a urban heat island effect. Urban forests, the urban area is already hotter than nearby areas. And climate change we've seen like a lot more fire in our urban forest recently, a scary amount of fire. And that's kind of combined with things like drought and higher temperatures and milder winters that are really changing the ecology. And because urban forests are in a very fragmented landscape, there's not the same potential of resilience. It's much harder for plants, for example, to move into new areas and expand their range northward when they're already fragmented in these urban areas. I think forest pathogens, and I'm talking about tree disease when I say that, are actually one of the top 4 as well. I don't hear this as much, but we're losing tremendous amounts of trees, and we have lost tremendous amounts of trees to forest pathogens in our forest and also in the region recently. And this is one of the most important things that I'm considering when I'm doing management actions. And then we actually don't have deer at the Thane Family Forest, but I always like to include that because I think that in urban areas that have deer are the most existential threat to the future of the forest. And in many areas, we're not seeing any regeneration at all due to high deer populations. The good thing is that none of these problems need super innovative solutions. If we just do and implement active forest stewardship, we can find solutions to a lot of these problems. So in the Thane Family Forest, we have a very competent team implementing active stewardship to protect our forests. So I'll introduce the Thane Family Forest a little bit here. The Thane Family Forest is the old growth forest. It's 50 acres that's at the heart of the New York Botanical Garden. It's the largest old growth forest remaining in New York City. The Thane Family Forest has a pretty good capacity. I think a lot of people would be jealous of our capacity. For that 50 acres, we have a forest manager, me, and then we have 2 forest horticulturalists. We have a full-time gardener and full-time botanical garden aide that are able to work in the forest. And a lot of their time goes toward, like I said, invasive species management. About 60% of their time. And we have very high levels of visitation. Due to that high levels of visitation, we're very careful about managing visitor impacts. All of our trails are actually surrounded by split rail fences to prevent people from walking off trail. We've actually closed a lot of trails in the past kind of 30 years. And we've created more intense water, infrastructure to manage water than many other areas. A lot of our trails have ditches. We have something called fords, which are kind of stone structures in the ground that allow water to travel over trails. And the goal is to find an aesthetic way to allow for that kind of impact, but also create trail sustainability. And because the Thane Family Forest is, like I said, it's in the middle of the Bronx, it's a really important resource for education, mentorship, and research. We have a lot of, scientists that want to study here. We have a lot of school children that come here, and people interested in the conservation field who would like to learn more or have different levels of mentorship that want to do internships and things like that here. And that's, one of the pleasures of my job is being able to interact with all these different people. So the primary goal of managing the Thane Family Forest is to protect the forest's unique flora, fauna, and its ecosystem processes while ensuring that it continues to be safe, accessible, and inspiring to garden visitors, researchers, and educators. And our goals, context, plans, and strategies, if you really want to read a lot, they're all highlighted in the Thane Family Forest Program, which is a large document that's freely available online. And if any of you are interested, feel free to reach out to me, and I'm very willing to share that with you. And we evaluate success, especially in our invasive management program, using an adaptive management framework. So basically, when I say adaptive management, I'm sure this is a term that many of you know. It's kind of very simple in concept. Basically, with adaptive management, you try an action, and then you see if that action works. And then if it works, you keep doing it. If it doesn't, you pivot, and you kind of think about better options. And for that to work, you need to collect data. So you have to have some way of evaluating success. So we collect data on inputs. So, how much time we spend doing things like doing invasive removal. We also collect data on how many invasives, for example, of each species we remove. And then every 5 years, we do a really comprehensive monitoring of the vegetation in the forest. We call this the continuous forest inventory. 15% of the forest is covered by belt transects, which are transects that have plots along them. It's 250 plots total, and every 5 years we look at the understory and overstory vegetation in those plots. And that really lets us have a really detailed understanding of the impact of our management work. And one of the most important things that we can take away from our management is how different actions can actually impact the forest in the long term. And because we have this data, we really are able to show successful outcomes with a lot of confidence. We're seeing increased native biodiversity in the forest. We're seeing reductions especially in woody invasive plant abundance. And we expect to continue seeing that over time. And that runs against some of the trends that we're seeing regionally, which definitely means that active management is a really successful tool for positive outcomes in forest health. That said, forests are dynamic systems. My predecessor in this position, I've only been here for 2 years, but my predecessor in this position, he wrote a paper basically comparing the first data that we have in this forest from Works Progress Administration tree surveys with the forest today. And what he found was, we have an old growth forest, and the structure of that forest has stayed remarkably the same. We still have an old growth forest. We still have the same basal area, but the composition of trees in the forest has dramatically changed. The biggest change is the forest used to be a hemlock grove. It literally used to be called the hemlock grove. Hemlock were one of the dominant trees in the forest, and you can kind of see the photo on the left is hemlock. The photo on the left and the right are the same exact location. And on the left, it's a photo from 1912 showing a hemlock stand. And on the right, you can see it's now dominated by deciduous hardwoods. There's a lot of maple, tulip, and other common hardwood species from our climate. And, we want to preserve native biodiversity, but, especially with a lot of the larger regional changes, especially with climate change, we don't expect to kind of have some historical habitat that we keep in a museum and that always will exist on this site. Our goal is to preserve native biodiversity, but allow for that kind of dynamic change as ecosystem conditions change. And we don't see it as a problem, and we're not trying to bring back the hemlock forest that was here 100 years ago. One more thing I like to talk about is that the Thane Family Forest, one of our goals is to make it a premier urban research forest. Because it's so accessible to people, we think it has and because it's one of the largest remaining old growth forests in an urban area in the Northeast, we think there's a lot of potential for it to advance a lot of science. And basically, we have a very long history of taking data in the forest because it's a botanical institution, because our horticulture team cares so much about data collection. We have a lot of historical data. We have 100 years of research that's been occurring in this forest. And then we have about 20 active projects that are going on every single year. And those kind of shift. Sometimes, different nonprofits, sometimes it's researchers, sometimes it's graduate students, and sometimes even high school students apply to do research here. And we try to prioritize projects that can support our forest management. So, if a project informs forest management at the Thane Family Forest, that's highest priority. But we also support projects that lead to improved outcomes for Bronx communities. For example, we have projects that are studying the urban heat island effect and how the forest can reduce that. And any science that really explores innovative ideas and especially solutions we support and we want to promote more of. And that's kind of balanced against the impact that research can have. So we try to be really thoughtful about how, especially when we have such a high quantity of research happening, that this research doesn't actually damage the really pristine remnant old growth that we're working so hard to protect. And we're very thoughtful about like citing research and things like that. So basically, our data shows that the work that we've done to protect the biodiversity has been incredibly successful, and it's continuing to be successful. The next step in our mind is to look at how we can enhance that success. How can we make this forest even more biodiverse? So as a result of kind of that line of thinking, we've put together a list of all of the species that have been lost from the Thane Family Forest at the New York Botanical Gardens. So that list was put together because of that history of research. We're able to understand which species were here 100 years ago. And we understand that in a lot of detail, especially due to the herbarium specimens that were collected from that time. So we were able to work with our William C. Steer herbarium team. And then we were able to do an inventory of the plants that are here now. And when you subtract the plants that were, here in the past from what's here now, you're able to see what that gap is, what's been missing. And it's about 115 species of native plants have been lost in the last 100 years. And then we thought about how could we recover those species? And this is one of our big projects right now. In addition to just, protecting the forest, we're trying to think about this, and we've broken this down into four main strategies. The first was to understand the soil of the forest. The second one was to look at that list of 115 species and narrow it down to the best candidates. So we narrowed it down to a list of about 10. The third strategy is to look at how those species that have been identified as candidates, how do they do in field conditions? So that entails field trial plots. And the last is a large-scale reintroduction design. So the goal of this project is to incorporate lost or extirpated species back into the spontaneous flora of the site. It's not just to do a planting and then they remain in the planting. We want them to be part of the ecology of the forest. So kind of think about how we could create a large-scale design of thousands of plants that can incorporate species back into that ecology. And right now, we have done a soil survey. And I'll talk about each of these points in a little bit more detail, but we did a soil survey. We've assessed our extirpated species list. We're currently on bullet point 3. So we're currently doing field trial plots, and we expect in a few years we can start for some of these species doing some larger field reintroduction designs. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the first part of this plan was, 115 years ago, these species were here, but our soils and our forests have changed a lot since then. So we want to understand what the conditions in our soils are. What's the acidity of our soils now? What's the heavy metal and other pollution impacts of our soils that might impact what species of plants can be here? So we basically did a systematic soil survey of the old growth forest area. And this was a collaboration. This wasn't something I would have been able to do on my own. It's one of the advantages of working somewhere like at the Botanical Garden is that we have a really strong education and we have a really strong science team. I worked with one of the scientists. His name was Dr. Brad Oberle. And collaboratively together, we put together a grant and a plan for looking at the forest soils. And a lot of the work was actually done by a team of interns that was from both of our departments. So we had a team of 6 interns. 2 of those interns were forest interns, and then 4 of them were science interns. Some of the interns are pictured here. Xavier, all the way at the left, was a graduate student. He was a master's student. Marielle in the middle was a college student. And then Fiona, all the way at the right, was actually a high school student. And we basically created a protocol. We sampled sites systematically across the forest. And that data is now being analyzed and published. And what it showed us was that a lot of conditions of like polluted conditions that we might have noted in the past, and for example, the 80s, have gotten better. We have less heavy metals in the soil than maybe not than we did 100 years ago, but than we did 30 years ago. And our soil acidity, which used to be very high, potentially connected to acid rain and other human impacts, our soil acidity has gone down. So this means that, you know, in many ways, since kind of like the late 1900s, our soil might be more appropriate for some of these species that we lost than we initially expected. So, you know, we did the soil survey, and then one of the things that I tasked my interns with, and I had very talented interns. Like I said, Xavier was a grad student, and Marielle, she was a high school student, but she was, you know, really a really talented high school student. And then we gave them this list of 115 species that were kind of candidates, not candidates, but like the potential list of extirpated species. And for their final project, we asked them to see if they could each narrow down maybe 4 or 5 species that they thought were the best candidate species for reintroduction. And then I also looked at that list, and then together we came up with a list of about 12 species that we think are worth trialing in the forest. The way that we broke that larger list down into the candidate species was by looking at a few different things. One, we considered climate change. We considered reference populations, for example, species that were present in similar conditions, such as urban parks, were considered better candidates than species that were not. We also considered habitat conditions. A lot of our habitats have changed. Some of the plants even were bog plants. There's no more bogs, you know, natural bogs at NYBG, so those plants were immediately not considered. And we even considered things like, are the dispersal and pollinators, dispersers of seeds and pollinators of plants still present? So, you know, once we kind of took our larger list and we put it through the lens of all these different conditions, that really helped us narrow it down. And I want to focus on this plant here because it's one of the best candidates that we came up with. So I'm sure many of you know this plant. It's bloodroot. On the right, you can see it pictured in our native plant garden. That's a cultivated, you know, part of the garden. And on the left, you can see one of our trial plots that we've already installed. The trial plots, because of environmental conditions, we weren't able to make them perfect grids often. Generally, we were trying to conceptually make the trial plots 5 by 5 grids so that they could be monitored a little bit easier with about 1 foot spacing initially. And we found that that's often challenging because we're trying to do as little impact to the forest as we can. And in this example, you can see that there's a large rock in the trial plot that impacted it. But largely, these were a grid pattern that we followed. And then we monitor those trial plots to see the success of the plants over time. And this trial plot was planted a year ago, so it's had 1 summer of monitoring, and we found that bloodroot are very successful. One thing I thought that was interesting, kind of like an intersection of our research with this extirpated species reintroduction project, is that we actually had researchers at the forest in the past who studied Aphenogaster genus ants. Aphenogaster ants are the ants that disperse bloodroot seeds. So bloodroot disperse through something called an elasmosome. It's a little part of the seed that's specifically attractive to ants. So the ants, they find the seed, they bring it to their nests, And that's the main way it's, and this is true of a lot of spring ephemerals, but that's the main way the seed spreads on the landscape. So we already had data that showed that the ants that are responsible for dispersing this plant are well distributed and abundant across the property. And we didn't see any other, after the soil survey, we didn't see any other real limiting factors. And we think that the reason this plant was initially lost from the forest was actually due to overcollection. We used to have a really big problem, especially in our natural areas, of people just thinking they could take plants. And we even have photos of groups where hundreds of plants were confiscated from one day of them walking through the forest. And bloodroot is a very long-lived plant. If you remove a small amount of the population every year, it's not that hard to get rid of it. So we think that the reason it was extirpated is probably gone, and the conditions are very favorable for it. And our trial plots are looking very good. We're seeing a lot of reproduction and flowering in the trial plots. And we're hopeful that this is a species that is going to be one of the first species we can introduce at a broader level and create a larger reintroduction design in a couple years' time. And one more thing I want to add is that when we're doing these trial plots, when we're looking at sourcing species to test and evaluate and then finally reintroduce, we're working with a lot of different partners that do local seed sourcing. So we're working with Greenbelt Native Plant Center, now Pecan, the Plant Ecology Center and Nursery, which is a project of New York City Parks. And I've had a lot of support, especially from Patrick Over at Pecan. And then we're also in a lot of conversation and collaboration with Hilltop Hanover, which is a nursery that does similar work in Westchester, and with the Wildwoods Restoration Project, which is a smaller nonprofit in the lower Hudson Valley. And then, like I said, the goal is that once we have enough data and we feel very confident, we're going to design a larger reintroduction project. So kind of moving on a little bit, we've learned a lot, and we have a lot of capacity from the work that we've done at the garden. But plants and a lot of ecology don't really stop at landscape boundaries. And one of the great things I think about PRISM, about all the different prisms, is it's a way for us to collaborate and look beyond those property boundaries and work together. And here at the garden, we've been thinking about that a lot as well. And one program that we've been trying to really expand is our Bronx River Watershed Health and Resiliency Program. So we have the Bronx River goes through the garden. It actually goes through the middle of the forest. And we recognize that even though a very small amount of that watershed is on our land, the actual health of that river is impacted by a much larger group of stakeholders and landowners. And we're working on leveraging all of our expertise and all of our kind of credibility and experience and capacity, and using that to promote health of the Bronx River watershed in a way that will end up trickling literally back to us, where we'll have a healthier river going through the forest as a result of that. And one thing that we recognize is that forest health is really critical for watershed health. Like I said before, forests keep our water clean. And one opportunity that we applied successfully for to do this was the DEC Community Reforestation Funding Opportunity, also called DEC Core. And we wrote a successful grant for DEC Core, and you can kind of see on the map to the right all the different sites where we're going to be doing reforestation work. The project focus here is going to be planting trees, removing invasive species, and convening different partner groups. And we have 6 different reforestation sites across the watershed. And as you can see, those 6 sites are kind of widely spaced throughout a larger area up at, between the Bronx and Westchester County to the north. And there's 6 sites total. 3 of those sites are going to be on land owned by Westchester Parks. Westchester Parks owns a lot of land along the Bronx River. One of those sites is actually watershed land. It's Department of Environmental Protection land along the reservoir that feeds into the Bronx River. And two of the sites are at the New York Botanical Garden itself. Across all those sites, we're going to be planting 750 trees total. And a lot of thought has gone into the trees that we're choosing for this work. We're thinking a lot about climate change, obviously. We're also thinking a lot about site condition. The sites that we want to work are sites often in the floodplain that are exposed to a lot of flooding, and certain trees are much better adapted to that than others. We're thinking about biodiversity. We're trying to, we don't know exactly what future conditions are going to be. So if you want a resilient site, planting more biodiversity is better than less biodiversity. And then we're also considering stakeholder input. Like I said, with, the more urban your site is, the more people care about it and are connected to it. And those people in my opinion, have a right to really have a say into what goes into those spaces. And like I said, there's a lot of different collaborators that are going to be working on this project, in addition to the two landowners that are going to be, the three landowners. There's NYBG, there's Westchester County Parks, and New York City DEP, or Department of Environmental Protection. There's two groups that are going to be supporting the project from more of a capacity standpoint. Westchester Parks Foundation and the Bronx River Parkway Reservation Conservancy are both groups that can bring together large groups of volunteers to support restoration and invasive removal work and tree planting work. So, we're always limited by staff capacity. And the benefit is these groups are always looking for exciting, interesting things, valuable things to do with their volunteers. So we were able to connect with them, and they were very enthusiastic about bringing their volunteers to help us get all these trees planted and help us make sure that all these invasives at these sites are managed. And the goal is that this project isn't going to be a one-off. It's not going to be like we do all these little pilot restorations, but I really want us to start thinking about the Bronx River watershed as a larger holistic landscape and thinking about where are the different sites where it's feasible, where it's high priority to be focusing our restoration money, and then building collaborations that are really enduring so we can support each other and support the needs of different organizations to make sure we're able to get this work done. These are two photos of the NYBG sites. So I'm going to show, of the 6 sites, I'm going to show 4 of them. So these are the 2 NYBG sites. The one to the left is a more upland site, and the one to the right is a floodplain site. You can kind of see the Bronx River just past the silver maple. The upland site is our smallest site. It's only 1/10 of an acre. And this site was really dominated by linden viburnum, by angelica tree, and by honeysuckle. The site, as you see it, this photo is actually taken before I wrote after I wrote the grant, but a lot of the work ended up, it was actually done before I realized I could put this into the grant. So I don't have a full before with the thicket of invasives. This photo is after most of the invasives have been cut and removed. But you can imagine that all the open areas of that site were thick invasive brush that was preventing any new native tree regeneration. And the goal of this site is to get rid of the resprouts of all those invasives that were previously removed, and then do a large container planting to fill in the native vegetation. And even though this grant is really only for tree regeneration, we're going to support it as well with herbaceous and shrub plantings as well. And as much as possible, we'd like these to be from local source, but sometimes with tree plantings, it's difficult to source the trees we need all from local ecotype. The site to the right is, like I said, a floodplain site. And this area has a lot of ash, a lot of silver maple and tulip tree and red maple. And this area does have a canopy of trees, but it's a declining canopy in many ways. And we're expecting that when a lot of those trees die, you can kind of see there's a very strong knotweed monoculture in the understory. And this site, we're not going to get rid of the knotweed. We're not spraying herbicide in either of these sites. We're actually using a technique that we've tested at the garden and found to be very effective. We're going to be cutting the knotweed 3 times a year for the duration of the grant. And that's something we have the capacity for because we have a tremendous amount of volunteer labor. A lot of volunteer groups want to work at the garden, but that might not be something other organizations have capacity for. And we've done pilot projects in the past where we found that if you plant even into 15-foot tall dense knotweed monocultures, if you cut it 3 times a year and you plant robust stock, your trees do well. We have trees that are 15 feet tall that were planted using these methods, and that's our hope, is basically to expand those plantings into this new site through this grant. To show some of the diversity of sites, here's 2 more sites. The site on the left is actually a lawn at Westchester Parks, where we're going to basically expand the forested area in the background. We're going to expand that kind of toward the viewer. So this is going to be about 1/3 of an acre of lawn that's turned into forest. And the site at the right is the only site that we're not going to be doing any tree plantings. So the site at the right is the DEP, or Department of Environmental Protection site. It's our largest site at 3 acres. And it's a site where the issue wasn't really a lack of tree regeneration. There was actually a large past tree planting that occurred at the site. The issue here is that the site became overwhelmed with invasive species, in particular porcelainberry, that is causing it, if no action is taken, the site is not going to regenerate into forest. However, with really serious invasive removal, we expect that this site is going to regenerate into forest if that limitation is removed. And you can see that's Tom, who runs Trillium Invasive Species Management, taking a look at that site, and he's the contractor that we expect will be doing a lot of that work. So with this work of expanding our work into the Bronx River watershed's forests, we expect that this will be a project, like I said at the beginning, that stakeholders are very interested in, and we really welcome that kind of interest and feedback. So one of our priorities with this project is to engage the communities near the sites. A lot of that engagement work is being directed by Genesis Abreu, who's the Director of Urban Conservation Partnerships at NYBG. And that's going to include tours, presentations, invitations to attend tree plantings, input into site management, feedback on community concerns, and bringing basically people's interests and goals into the project as much as we're able. And we really want people in the local community to feel a sense of connection and ownership of those sites. Both because I think it's really important people feel connection to nature, but I also think that this will lead to a much more successful project. When I worked at Westchester Land Trust, I found that I often, if there was an issue with one of my sites, because I was so well connected often to the community, people would tell me about things before they became a problem. And that meant that I was able to respond to things. And also people if people care about your sites, they tend not to cause problems that are going to lead to issues with that, especially in urban areas, with them being successful. And this is a photo here. It's actually in one of the sites that we're going to restore of one of the groups that was doing the knotweed cuttings that I was mentioning. So the area where they're standing prior to their work was about probably 5 to 6 feet of knotweed that they cut back during that project. So I'm going to end with this. To love a place is not enough. We must find ways to heal it. And this quote is by Robin Kimmerer. She's famous for writing Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a book about basically how you can integrate the indigenous ideas of land stewardship with more scientific kind of understandings of land management. And one thing that I feel like is very important that I've always taken away from her writing is that there's this really important idea of reciprocity with the land, that often people think that like people are bad, people cause bad things to happen, but actually we could have a reciprocal relationship with the land. We can take from the land and take the things we need, but we can also be thankful, and as a part of that we can give back. And I think this kind of work, restoring the land that all of you are doing, is a really important part of that relationship. And we can bring as many people into that, even if they're not practitioners, as possible. So that's the presentation. I tried to be really broad, but a lot of these things I could have talked about in much more detail. So if people have questions, I'm very happy to talk more and answer them and have more of a discussion.
Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you.
Cassidy's going to manage our questions coming in, any questions coming in through the chat.
Yes, just scrolling through now. Let's see. So Dr. Greg Kramer asked, with climate change, what might be some of the more, sorry, my mouse is covering, south ranging native trees and shrubs you would plant or consider planting?
So one tree that I really like to highlight is at the garden, we have one of the northernmost stands of sweet gum. I'm sure that someone can prove me wrong and find an even more northernmost one. And I'm sure there's some in Connecticut as well that I don't know about. But I think we have one of the northernmost ones that can be considered a stand. So I think sweet gum's a really good species. And kind of going back to that forest inventory data that I talked about before, we're really seeing the next generation of trees is going to be very heavily sweet gum. So to me, that sounds like a response to climate change, that's a tree that might have been present, but not super dominant, that now wants to become much more dominant and could probably do pretty well either further north of here if there was a seed source. So sweet gum's a species that I very highly recommend. Some other species that I just see kind of observationally doing very well that are already present, but I think are going to be very much more dominant, include black tupelo. I think that tulip tree is doing very well. Tulip tree was already very common, but I think could become even more common. Red maple, I think, is one of the most adaptable trees that exists. And I think as a result, it's not necessarily at the northern edge of its range, but because of that adaptability, I think it's going to do very well with climate change. And then we're also in the forest itself, in the old growth forest, we're not doing kind of assisted migration style plantings. But the interesting thing is, even though we have noticed certain species that are a good example is umbrella magnolia, that we're north of their actual range, but we planted in our cultivated collections, are spreading into the forest. And we're not managing those as invasive species. We're just kind of monitoring them. And I think that umbrella magnolia in particular is a species that I think we should be, I'm not saying we should be planting it necessarily, but I think there should be a conversation around it. It's a species that is native to Philadelphia, so just south of here, and we're seeing where it's planted, it's spreading. Other species that I'm bringing to discussions. I'm not planting unless, I feel like people are giving me good feedback on it, but I'm bringing to discussions even include things like bald cypress, which there's bald cypress native to southern New Jersey. And I've seen stands of it that people have told me are native, but you never know if it was actually planted or not. So I could talk about that for a very long time, but that's, some of my thoughts.
Yeah, those are all really great species to look out for and consider planting as migrations happen naturally or as we assist with climate change. Thank you. Desiree asks, how can someone learn to take forest inventory?
I think there's a lot of, I'm not going to go into the details of kind of forestry and the different methods themselves, but there's a lot of really simple ways to learn more about forest stands. And I would recommend just kind of joining people that are doing that work. So I don't know where you are in your kind of professional career, but if you have an opportunity to either do an internship or if you're kind of already a professional in this field, just kind of finding someone who's doing it and joining them for a day. A lot of these methods aren't too complicated. I think a lot of people are doing different things. The methods that we're using aren't necessarily standard forestry methods. We're kind of using a lot of different methods to look at things. But I think using pretty simple tools and with a small amount of instruction, I think you'd feel comfortable doing a forest inventory.
Yeah, great answer. I'd also add there's lots of resources on the internet you can probably look up, depending what you're trying to inventory, whether it's like species diversity or percent cover and different things like that. You can do probably a quick Google search and you'll find lots of resources. So Desiree also asks, when do you cut the knotweed? She's been told not to cut it before.
I mean, we did a published study where we basically, we try to use herbicides. We don't not use herbicides at all at the garden, but we're very sensitive to the impacts of herbicides. And as a result of that, we try to use non-chemical management wherever possible. And the vast majority of our work has been non-chemical management. The main thing in the forest we use herbicides or chemical like pesticides for is tree pathogens if we want to protect trees from certain invasive pests. So we cut knotweed. We basically looked at like is there an effect of cutting it 3 times a year? And the times that we cut it are kind of late spring, early summer, so maybe like June, and then like a midsummer cut and a late summer cut. And if you have a really robust stand, maybe you want to add 1 more cut the first year. And then if it's a more shady stand, you could probably get away with 2 cuts. And we did a study where we compared that cutting style to digging up knotweed and to doing nothing. And the digging and the cutting were equally effective over time at really reducing the robustness of the knotweed. And then once we plant trees into the knotweed, when you have that knotweed that's kind of the robustness is dramatically reduced, and you plant trees into it, those trees, this is actually the photo I have here is that tree planting that we did. And trees of that size with this practice are able to get to canopy closure if you plant them densely enough, that within a couple years, they're actually, at least in our circumstance, they're actually able to shade out the knotweed to the point that I'm not doing in this particular stand where we planted the trees about 3 years ago. We're not doing a lot of knotweed cutting anymore just because it's too shady for it. So uh, I guess I don't know who said not to cut it, but we have pretty good evidence that cutting it is effective if it's done frequently enough.
That's great. It's really cool to hear that you can actually shade it out as you begin to cut aggressively and dig and plant with it. That's really cool.
And we're not expecting to ever eradicate it. I just want to be clear about that. Like all of our sites will have knotweed probably forever, but the goal is to have a balance and have a diverse ecosystem.
Great point. Some folks in chat added that there's sweet gum in Greenwich and up in Rockland County and a little bit of Westchester, but it sounds like we're kind of in this area a little bit on its northern edge, most likely. So very cool to know.
I've never seen a wild sweet gum tree north of 287, and I've spent a lot of time in the woods. So I'm sure they're there, but we're definitely very close to the northern range of the species.
Yeah, I think so. Phil asks, is there a problem with deer in the northern portion of the watershed?
Yes. So deer are a big problem. Again, not at the forest itself, because we're it's the one-way fragmentation kind of helps us. We're so surrounded by the urban landscape that there isn't really a corridor that deer are able to get into the garden. Although even with all that, every once in a while a deer shows up, but there hasn't been any in the last 2 years while I've been here. But once you go up into the suburbs, if any of you are familiar with Westchester, deer browse in the southern part of Westchester is tremendously bad, where you really get the kind of like understory desert, where it's either like all barberry or nothing. And kind of moving into northern Westchester, there's a little bit of hunting pressure. A lot of groups do have some sort of deer management program, and you definitely get like some regeneration, but it's still nowhere near adequate. So the central Westchester Reservoir that is at kind of the northern edge of the watershed where we're doing our work, I would say deer are very overabundant, but less so than in southern Westchester.
Let's see. Steve Young asks, Have you written a management guide for these types of urban forests? We're working with a similar project in Central Park, Schenectady.
So we have a forest management program, which is pretty detailed. It's about it's like 70 pages. And our current forest management program covers the period from 2016 to 2025. So that means we're updating it right now. We're gonna probably very soon I almost said next year, very soon this year, we're gonna have the updated plan to 2035. And I don't know specifically if that's what you're referring to, because this is more of a management plan just for our forest. It's not for like a whole spectrum of forest types. But we are working on that. And if you have other kind of thoughts on how that could be, I know New York City Parks does a lot of different broader spectrum management plans. They produce a lot of really high quality management plans and reports. So that might be more close to what you're interested in, or what you're referring to. But, you know, we are very interested in really having clear strategies and goals and guiding our management behind that and being able to really evaluate and document success and then be able to have something that we can share with other people. And you need to have a good plan to be able to do any of that.
Definitely. Great questions. So I'll give you guys another minute. That was all the questions we had, but feel free to put another in chat. But in the meantime, I have a quick question. I was wondering if you know, or if anyone has studied what the cause of the decline of the hemlocks in the forest may have been, whether it's change in microclimate and moisture, or perhaps hemlock woolly adelgid, or just climate change in general.
So it's a lot of different things. Often people think that it's all hemlock woolly adelgid and elongate scale, but actually our hemlocks have been declining for a long time. When I said we had 100 years of research, you know, we have research going back to the 1800s, and a lot of that was focusing on hemlock. And you actually saw people even 100 years ago saying that the hemlocks are in decline, and trying to understand why they were in decline. And I think that early on that decline was due to different reasons than it is now. It is very likely that the management techniques used to take care of the forest were different 100 years ago. Some areas of the forest were even kind of landscaped, where they would like rake the leaves away, for example. They didn't cut down the trees, but they like kind of treated it almost more arboretum style. And then we also had a tremendous amount of just like human foot traffic. We didn't have trails. People just walked through the forest. And some of the researchers from that time complained that like everything was trampled and there was no understory vegetation. So probably human overuse was one of the first things, and that kind of trampling and soil compaction. And one of the next things that probably affected our hemlock grove is that we're one of the southernmost hemlock stands along the coastal plain. I'm sure, again, like with the sweet gum, someone could find a coastal plain hemlock stand in Staten Island or, you know, coastal plain of New Jersey, but there's not many. And if you look at a lot of the early research reports on our hemlocks, they refer to them as the southernmost large stand of hemlocks. Again, if you go in the mountains, you can go all the way down to the Georgia. But outside of the mountains, there's not that many hemlocks further south of us. And because of that, they really were not in a good place with climate change. Even probably like the small amounts of climate change that were already existing historically, were already pushing the hemlock to the edge of their kind of tolerance. And then obviously once we had these diseases move in, hemlock woolly adelgid, you know, it didn't kill every hemlock, but it really decimated our hemlocks. And then elongate scale came around, combined with much more rapid climate change, really putting them out of their kind of comfort zone. You know, that it really decimated our hemlocks from the point where 30% of the trees in the forest 100 years ago were hemlock. And now we only have like 50 hemlocks left. They are still existing though. They still survive, and there even is a small amount of reproduction. There's two small hemlocks that naturally, I could show you that are naturally reproducing in the forest. So there's some hope they'll be around, but not a big part of the forest ecosystem. And if it wasn't for climate change, I'd probably try to restore them. But the fact that they're not really well adapted to what the forest is going to look like in the future, we'd rather just kind of let the forest naturally be dynamic. And if it wants to be more sweet gum dominated, that's where, that's the direction it's going to go.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
So if
So
there aren't any other questions, oh, I'm sorry. Did you have
I was
something
just
to add?
thank you, but yeah,
Yeah, I think we can start to wrap up. Thank you so much, John, for a great presentation and for joining us. And I'll hand it back to Abby to wrap this up.
Yeah.
thank you. Bye.
Thank you, John. And thank you, everybody, for submitting such great questions. I feel like that was a great discussion on it, too. So just to wrap up, wanted to ask if there's any other business, any last minute announcements, if you missed the announcement part, anything to share from those still on the call. If you want to put that in the chat, you can. One thing that we forgot to mention is that our annual report is available on our website now if you want to dive back and see what we worked on in 2025. There's a lot of great pictures and a lot of great work that we worked on. The team did a lot of work to put this report together and highlight some of our accomplishments. So take a look at that on our website in the resources tab. You'll see it there. Any other business? All right. One last plug for the Resilient Long Island Symposium coming up on March 19th to the 21st. Please sign up. Please join us there. We'd love to see you there, and we'll have more great presentations just like the ones you heard today in person at Hofstra University and other locations. And lastly, thank you. Our next partners meeting will be hybrid again and on May 15th. Location to be announced, but probably at the Sisters of St. Joseph in Brentwood. And thank you so much for joining us today.